So in an earlier class, when we talked about communism, post-communism, we talked about the Soviet leaders, and there's actually a joke about the Soviet train. I probably won't tell you because my wife thinks it's not that funny. But just to start off, just to remind you of who these guys are, Lenin created a federal system when after taking power. He banned alternative parties, any sort of civil society activism, because after all, the Communist Party and this, the elites within the vanguard of the proletariat, right? The elites within the Communist Party know what the society needs. Lenin nationalized industry in the name of people, the people. He expanded the state apparatus, and in the process, he created this what we call the nomenklatura, which is a long-standing class with premium state and economic jobs. Remember, the economy is actually controlled by the state, so we're talking about jobs within the bureaucracy and the economic structures. So that's Lenin right there. Then, you can see images, Google. So right next to Lenin is Stalin right here. Stalin was the one who ruled over the state in a totalitarian fashion. He led collectivization, in other words, forcing peasants off of their farms and to collectivize their farms, bring them all together. He orchestrated a series of 5-year industrialization plans, which moved the country from this agrarian state to an industrial state. And he fomented this cult of personality. Millions of people were killed under Stalin, in large part because of the war. But you're still talking about millions, just lower level of millions, even without World War II. Some of the things that Stalin did, though, is he brought this huge infrastructure change. So industrialization, he brought roads, railways, schools, a healthcare system, things like electricity. This was a period where people had kids and they named them Electric Power Plant Grodsky, because this was this miracle, this huge leap in the standard of living for a lot of people. It was a politically closed system. There was a complete monopoly on information. The news was propaganda. So here's a joke from the time. I really like this joke. I'll tell you some of these jokes. Which is better, the newspaper or the TV? So you think which is better, newspaper or TV? Under Stalinism, of course. The answer is the newspaper, because you can't wipe your ass with the TV. So now we move on to Khrushchev. Khrushchev eventually wins control after Stalin dies. Stalin dies in 1953. Huge outpouring of emotion, as you would expect after the death of any personalistic leader with a cult of personality. And by 1956, Khrushchev has consolidated power. And this is the year of the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev stands up and he denounces Stalin, the excesses of Stalin. So again, very important in terms of a political culture framework for understanding what happens in the Soviet Union later. The 20th Party Congress, this is a period of massive reform. Or I should say massive reform. This isn't the period of massive reform. What this is, though, is it sets the stage for the massive reform that would happen in the 1980s under Perestroika and Glasnost. What this is it establishes a culture of attacking the way that the system was. So Khrushchev does initiate reforms, but he steps on lots of toes and is ultimately pushed out. So he's the one of these guys. Forget it. I was going to say he's the one that didn't die in power. But Gorbachev, of course, is still alive as of 2013. He's on the lecture circuit. But that's because the state disappeared under him. So next we've got Brezhnev. Brezhnev takes over with the ouster of Khrushchev, and this is known as the period of stagnation. Really what Brezhnev does is he promises the nomenklatura that he won't hurt them if they won't hurt him. So you've got a rise in corruption, and you've got this disjunction, this relative deprivation that we talked about before, where people have high expectations. The state creates these high expectations through a strong educational network and also through propaganda. And then the reality is that they have very little mobility. He dies, and everyone knows that there has to be change. And from 1982 to 1985, you have two geriatrics who are in power, Chernomyrdin and Andropov. And one of them, Andropov, starts reforms and then dies, and Chernomyrdin rolls them back and then dies. And then in 1985, bang, you've got Gorbachev. Comes to power to strengthen the system by reforming it. Again, it's important. He didn't want to end the system. He didn't want to kill the system. He wanted to strengthen the system by reforming it. And so he launches Glasnost and Perestroika to bring incentives to workers so that it's a more efficient system to root out corruption. This wasn't very popular. Um, he cracked down on workplace absenteeism. He limited alcohol sales. With respect to alcohol, you had higher prices, major restrictions on supply, and so you had huge lines for access to the only thing that there used to not be lines for. So this is problematic, and a lot of people remember him for this. Glasnost also revealed that the system was severely broken, and people went crazy with pent up anger. There were lots of demands. Nationalism increased. People felt they would be better off without this overarching system. Some wanted to go faster with respect to the reforms, and others really wanted to roll these reforms back. And so there was a coup in 1991. Yeltsin came out as this hero. He bans the Communist Party, which was Gorbachev's source of power. And for Gorbachev, really, it was over. Within a very short period, so the coup was in August. By Christmas, the Soviet Union officially ends, Christmas 1991. Russian democracy got off to a very rough start. Yeltsin's 1993 constitution is what provoked the picture that you see in front of you. This happened actually just a couple months before I arrived in Russia. What happened was Yeltsin wanted new parliamentary elections in 1993, and he held a referendum that would allow him to do these. Parliament then tried to impeach him, and a majority of voters voted in that referendum that I mentioned, for new elections. There was a power struggle which came about between Parliament and the President. Each was issuing and ignoring the other's laws and decrees. So Yeltsin decided he had to do the only thing that a good Democrat will do, and he dissolved the Parliament, which was known as the Supreme Soviet, even though this was unconstitutional. Okay? And what he did is he replaced the Constitution with his new Constitution, which gave the President much greater powers. And then you had clashes between parliamentary supporters and the presidential supporters. Parliamentarians barricaded themselves into the Parliament building, then known as the White House, for days. And finally, ultimately, the military decided to take Yeltsin's side, and it attacked the Supreme Soviet. The Supreme Soviet being the name of the parliament at that point. And so there you see, that's what happens when a tank attacks your parliament building. The gist here is that democratization is tumultuous and dangerous. And in fact, there's been plenty of research saying that while democracies don't fight wars with each other, newly democratizing states are among the most unstable states around. In other words, if you're going to have your choice between authoritarian neighbors or newly democratizing neighbors, take the authoritarian ones. So what we're going to talk about is the 1993 constitutional order, because that's the one that's still standing. So we'll start with the judiciary. The judiciary has been highly corrupt since 1991, especially with privatization and the rise of organized crime. Organized crime used to be everywhere. I'm not sure to what degree that still exists today. I think much less, because this was really a Yeltsin-era phenomenon, and then Putin kind of cleaned up a lot of this. But bribery is very common in Russia today. Corruption is very high. So in terms of the judiciary, they recently admitted jury trials in some cases in an effort to try to take the taint off the system, where judges, in many cases, are still seen as politicized. If you actually look at a Russian trial, you'll find that defendants they're sitting in a cage. The most recent case of Pussy Riot, which is this punk rock band that went into a famous Russian church and sang against Putin, these three of them were caught. The other ones ran away, and they were wearing masks. And of those three, two of them were sent off to hard labor. Interestingly, this, rather than having a stultifying effect like the regime wanted, this actually mobilized at least a small segment of the population. But anyway, so with respect to the judiciary, remains highly politicized and accused of corruption. Now, the Constitutional Court, more important for what we study, is composed of 19 individuals who are appointed by the president and approved by the upper house, which isn't particularly meaningful. You'll see why when we talk about the upper house. What the Constitutional Court has is the power of abstract review. They can rule on cases even when they're not submitted to them. And they have also got the power of concrete review. They can rule on specific cases that work their way up through the court system. They are not, by the way, the court of last appeal with respect to criminal cases. Just something that you should keep in the back of your mind. So if you think how this relates to other courts we've studied, is it stronger? Is it weaker? Well, think about that for a second. Keep thinking. Okay. Geez, to answer that question, you really have to think more about political culture than simply institutional design. The Constitutional Court has historically been ignored. Regional leaders blow off the rulings. And if you're ignored routinely, what you do is you engage in self-censorship. Don't take cases that you know regional leaders are going to ignore your outcome on, because that's going to lower your credibility. So anything that the status quo political elites disagree with, you should probably stay away from. Now, since the Constitutional Court came in bed with Putin and then the Putin-Medvedev team, people have listened, but there's still the question of self-censorship. An interesting point here with respect to the judiciary is the European Court of Human Rights, which frequently rules against Russia. So Russia is a party to this. And it actually sometimes has an impact on local judicial processes, where local courts will say, well, we need to abide by the European Court of Human Rights, and therefore. So it's a great thing for Russians from that perspective. The executive system in Russia is a semi-presidential system. So this is the second semi-presidential system we've talked about. The first one being in, that's right, France. Power here is divided between the president, who's directly elected for 2 4-year terms, and the prime minister. The president has a lot of power. And unlike in France, this power is constitutionally mandated. So the president, and again, this is what Yeltsin ran through early on in the democratic process. So the president chooses the prime minister and the cabinet. The lower house can reject them, but then after 3 times of rejecting them, the president can simply dissolve the lower house. So there's not much of an incentive to actually reject the prime minister and cabinet choice, because you could be out of your job if you do it too much. The president chooses governors of the 7 broad regions. Well, actually, that's not true. I take that back. The president did choose the governors of the 7 broad regions up until 2012, and as of now, there are actually elections for those regions. Now, I'll note that in 2012, United Russia dominated the 5 gubernatorial spots that were open. United Russia being Putin's party, so it doesn't really make much of a difference because Putin still runs the political sphere. The president can rule by decree in certain spheres, can propose and veto legislation, and frequently is the one who does this. The president also controls key ministries like the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, the interior ministry, the FSB, so the intelligence services. These are known as the power ministries. Right? The president can only be removed for a grave crime with the approval of the high courts and 2/3 of both houses. So it's very difficult to impeach this president. As in terms of what the prime minister does, well, the prime minister basically supervises all the ministers and supports the president's agenda in parliament. Usually, this is a career bureaucrat with technical expertise. But under Putin, it became a political, more political position. So we could compare the Russian semi-presidential system to the French one. And I think it's worth doing. In terms of the French president is technically the head of state, but not the head of government. Constitutionally, the French president, as we mentioned, is given very few formal powers. In Russia, the president is constitutionally given significant formal powers, including running parts of the state. The French president has no term limits. The Russians gave them term limits, but they also found ways around them very quickly. So Putin was the president 1 term, 2 terms, and then he took his hand-picked prime minister and said, hey, you're going to be the president next. You're going to run for president, and I'll make sure you win. And so Medvedev runs for president and wins, and Putin decides he's going to be the prime minister. And so suddenly all the power goes from the president to the prime minister. and that works well for 4 years, and then Putin can run again, and so he does, and now he's president again. So no term limits in the French case. In Russia, they've gotten around the whole the whole term limit thing, which technically exists. The French president appoints the prime minister, who's approved by the lower house, but then that prime minister does his own council of ministers, his own cabinet. Although in reality, usually the president does this too, if they're from the same party. But in Russia, the president does the cabinet also, no matter what. And he can dissolve parliament, again, if they reject his government. So, again, stronger power in the Russian case. French and Russian prime ministers are usually assistants to the president, but this is fuzzy because in France, when the president and parliament slash prime minister are from different parties, the prime minister can have teeth, cohabitation, right? In Russia, the president turned the prime minister, really the prime ministerial position, into the dominant position right before he took it. So this is in part about individuals. But in both cases, the president has to consent to the laws. In both cases, the president can dissolve the legislature and throw out the prime minister under certain circumstances. In both cases, the president's in charge of armed forces. The president draws up the budget. Although in France, there's no parliamentary approval process, well, in Russia, they actually need parliamentary approval for the budget. In both cases, they can hold no confidence votes. But remember, in France, it's sort of like calling a referendum. You're staking your reputation on the outcome, and then you resign or fire the prime minister if you lose. In Russia, the vote of no confidence in the government can exist, but then if they in parliament have the nerve to do this 3 times, you can get rid of them. Oh, I'm going to stop right here, and we'll go into another slide.